Good evening and welcome to tonight's program sponsored by the MetroWest Climate Solutions. I am the Reverend Dr. Stephanie May, a member of the steering committee and minister at First Parish in Wayland. I'm joined here with my colleague, the Reverend Jeff Barsnell, minister here at First Parish Church in Weston. MetroWest Climate Solutions, or MCS, is a partnership of congregations and organizations in the Metro West area, including First Parish Church in Weston, First Parish in Wayland, First Parish in Lincoln, Sustainable Weston Action Group, and a growing list of organizations and individuals. Our mission is to foster sustainable, resilient, and low-carbon communities. We do this by advocating at the local and state level and by hosting timely and relevant programs that encourage people and organizations to get involved in bringing about solutions to some of the great challenges of our time. While the challenges are immense and global, the solutions are mainly local. We believe that any path towards a more sustainable world involves all of us who reside here in industrialized countries and in the suburbs, making different choices regarding our food, transportation, and energy use. All of us have a role to play in moving our society and economy towards a low or no carbon future. For more information about our work or to view recordings of some of our past recordings, go to MetroWestClimateSolutions.org.
Thank you, Stephanie. As for tonight, we are pleased to welcome the Reverend Mariama White-Hammond to First Parish in Weston as part of MetroWest Climate Solutions. This program had to be rescheduled from early May, so I am thankful for Reverend Mariama for finding another time to come and join us and offer some remarks, a good word on the intersectional issues of climate equity and energy. We also want to say how delighted we are to be hosting an event that is actually live in person. Unlike our programs for the last 2.5 years, and forgive us for stating the obvious here, we are not just virtual tonight. We are here in person, live in front of an audience. And this program is blessed then to be both here live and in front of a live stream feed on Zoom, which is actually first for our group to do a hybrid format. So we thank Reverend Mariama for being our first presenter, our guinea pig in our new hybrid format. Perhaps it goes without saying. It goes without saying, but we are starting to see a growing number of people wake up to the predicament in which we find ourselves with respect to the climate. The climate is not just affecting people in other parts of the world anymore, but it's increasingly affecting people in our country, in our region, in our state, in our communities. And things are changing all over the world. Many of us perhaps woke up this morning to the news of air quality warnings here in the Boston area as a result of the unusual wildfires burning north of here in the Quebec province. The sun had an unusual red tint to it this morning as a result of the soot, the amount of soot in the atmosphere. Did anyone notice that? Kind of eerie, actually. Many of us are also monitoring the increasingly challenging and heartbreaking impacts from climate change around the world. For example, over the last few weeks, India and portions of Pakistan have experienced historically unprecedented high temperatures for this time of year. The temperatures in sections of eastern India last week shot up to over 110 degrees Fahrenheit with tropical-like humidity. Such conditions make it almost impossible for the human body to cool itself, this in an area where very few people have access to air conditioning. Portions of sub-Saharan Africa are also experiencing historically high temperatures, which adversely impacts the poorest people in that part of the world. Here in North America, California was battered by massive rainstorms called atmospheric rivers, no less, just a few months ago. Now portions of California and the Pacific Northwest are under drought conditions, and the threat of wildfires has increased yet again. Just last week, it was announced that State Farm Insurance will no longer sell home insurance policies in California because of the threat of wildfires. That is actually unprecedented. It's remarkable. And this is just but one example of the changes happening all over, everywhere, and all at once, to paraphrase the title of that movie. Much of this has been sadly predicted by the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. This partnership of the World Meteorological Society and the UN is the largest scientific body in history to study the natural systems of the Earth. Their warnings about the impacts of climate warming gases from fossil fuels and their recommendations about what to do about it are finally being heard and considered by governments all over the world. Well, at least some of them. Amidst the discussions about impacts and what to do, questions sometimes get lost in the mix about who is being impacted and how. It turns out that the people least responsible for climate change are often the first to suffer from the impacts of a warming world and an unstable climate. This may very well be one of the most important trends reported by future historians in the future. Questions of equity and fairness at the international, national, and regional level are now really being asked, and well, they should. Our guest tonight has been an influential voice in the climate justice movement as an ordained minister, scholar, community organizer, and more or less a lifelong resident of Boston. Have you lived at more or less? Except for the 4 years in California. Okay. Reverend Mariama White-Hammond has distinguished herself as a powerful advocate for policies that consider the impacts that our society's actions have on marginalized communities and groups. Tonight, she will explore the question of how residents of the suburbs can more effectively take action to help all communities in the area transition to a low and no carbon region fairly and equitably. Reverend White-Hammond founded the new Roots AME Church in Dorchester in 2018, where she serves as pastor. She's a dynamic preacher and speaker. And if you know her parents, that's probably not entirely a surprise. In addition, she was appointed in 2021 by Mayor Wu to serve as the Chief of Environment, Energy, and Open Space for the City of Boston. But I should note, she is not speaking from that capacity tonight. She wears many hats, and she brings well-informed and thoughtful perspectives to the challenges we face as we strive to build a more sustainable and equitable society and economy. And we are delighted she could be with us here tonight. So we're going to hear from Reverend White-Hammond, and then we're going to have some time for what I hope will be a robust Q&A or some discussion. Those of you tuning in on Zoom, and I know there's some of you, feel free to post your questions in the chat section, and Stephanie or I or someone will make sure we pick them up and pose them as we can. And now, Reverend White-Hammond.
Good evening. That's a little weak. Okay, we'll try it again. Good evening. Yes, this is the beauty of being able to be in person, that you can have that moment of call and response. And it is good to be with you this evening. And also a shout out to all the folks who are on Zoom. Where is the live stream? Oh, okay, back. Okay, great. So, and thank you to Reverend Stephanie and Reverend Jeff. And to all of the parishes that are part and the organizations that are part of anchoring this work, the MetroWest Climate Action. I mean, I think it's really important, as we'll talk through, that we create opportunities to act together, and you are living that out in this group. So it's good to be with you this evening. So I'm going to jump right in and talk a little bit about how I see this issue and how I frame it, because I think that's a pretty important place to start. And then I'll talk about the role of both faith communities and suburban communities in addressing issues of climate. And I'm trying to keep that all to 30 minutes so that the majority of our time is really about interacting, hearing your questions, talking in specifics about like how we might address this. As was said, I do serve in an official municipal role, but I'm not here in that role, which means I get to speak freely, and nothing that I say is attributed to the administration or anyone else, but able to talk sort of as a resident and someone who has cared about this issue for quite a while. So, I start off by framing the work I do, and when people ask me, people label me a climate activist, like lots of different things. And none of this is a rejection of any of those terms. I do work on environmental justice and I do work on climate action and all of those pieces. But if you ask me how I see the work, I use the frame of ecological justice, because the truth is that my work in justice did not begin with the climate crisis. I joke with people, I think one of my first works was when I was 7, I decided we were going to open a homeless shelter in our house. Nobody actually showed up. And I realized later in life that maybe the fact that the signs were in crayon made them question whether or not this was going to be a legitimate homeless shelter. But, throughout my life, I think from a very young age, and I would say it's almost a fire that God put in me and also was connected to the people that were in my life. My parents were students in the late 60s who were benefiting from the work of the civil rights movement and were able to attend schools that up until the point that they had arrived had not had very many Black students, and they were part of sort of a movement of folks coming here, many people being the first generation of the family to attend college. And so they met and fell in love, and we were born. I lived my first 3 years actually at a dorm at Harvard, which was a good time. Being a little kid, I had like tons of babysitters and could just move freely around the dorm. But I came up in a community of folks that came from deep faith traditions and believed that God has something to say about justice, and believed that their work of faith was also work of justice. And so growing up in that community, I think it's probably no accident that I very early on had a deep sense that we have a responsibility to look at the world and ask why things are as they are, and then to work actively to figure out how we move it closer to the way things should be. So I use the frame of ecological justice because eco means home. And regardless of the work that Elon Musk and others are doing to try to see if we can make it to Mars, as far as we know, this is the only home we have. And quite frankly, if we can't do well in this one home, I don't see why we should get in a space shuttle and go mess up another planet. I think it is our responsibility to live right in this place on which we are planted. And that is not saying I'm against space travel or anything else, but I am always concerned when people look to the future in a way that makes them not willing to deal with the reality of the present or the past. And so eco comes from the Greek word oikos, meaning home, and ecology as a discipline is one of the few sciences that doesn't try to break things down into smaller parts, but actually says you really understand an organism when you understand the environment around it, when you understand its relationship to other beings and other parts of the environment. And that's what is worth studying. Ecological study is system study. It looks at those relationships. And I believe that the problem we have is disordered relationships with one organism, particularly the human race, being the most confused of the species and causing deep harm and damage to all of the other folks with whom we share this home. Regardless of what you believe about how the world was created and whether there was a divine being involved in that or not, what you can see so blatantly is that our existence is intertwined. And you ask what kind of society where people whose bodies are about 70% water pollute what is in essence the source of life. I would hazard to guess no other species behaves like that. And when they do, they certainly don't claim to be smarter than everyone else in so doing. And so I really want to note that climate change did not come from nowhere. It is the result of deeply disordered relationships and priorities. And if we can't change those relationships and those priorities, I don't believe we deserve to survive. And I say this because many people are looking for technical solutions to solve this problem, while leaving intact the same disordered value system and thinking that will be the solution. I fundamentally do not believe we can or should survive unless we change the way we relate to each other and all the other beings with whom we share this home. And I say that because if you see it that way, then climate change is not a scientific or a technical problem. It is a social and spiritual problem that we must address by dealing with the social and spiritual roots to how we got here in the first place. And that's about how we value each other and how we distribute resources. Because there's more than enough on this planet for all of us to live, if we take what we need and not just what we want. And if we don't decide that some people have a right to certain kinds of resources, while others have to learn how to subsist on much less. And so in ecological justice, from the word home, I say that our goal is to figure out how we get some home training. Because for any of you who've, I think many of you may be parents, and so you may have experienced what it's like to teach a new human being how to live in a shared way. And there's a lot of the ways we behave that are ridiculous. Like we open the fridge, we see somebody else's name on it, and we eat it anyway. And then we don't even finish it. We just take a bite, realize we don't like it, and now the other person can't eat it. I don't even want to talk about what our bathroom analogies would be for the way that we behave as a species on this planet. But I start from that frame because I can talk about policy, and I will, but I do believe it's really important that we recognize this as an opportunity to fundamentally shift which values we're prioritizing. Because I will say this, I'm not saying we don't care about any of these things. I'm just saying that they are not the core forces that drive us. The idea of interdependence and sharing, the idea of leaving a space at least the same as or better than how you found it. I do believe those exist within us. And we do sometimes operate from those places. But I would say when you look at our policies of how we function in government, sometimes even in church, unfortunately, it is not reflective of our greatest and highest values. So I want to lean into this conversation about policy and values, and particularly this question of the suburbs. Well, first, let me talk about the role of faith communities, just as like a quick note, because I know not everybody's in a faith community, but I know there are a number of you who are. I do think it's worth noting that if our problem is a social spiritual one, then one of the things we really, really, really need to do is to help humans find a new story of who we are going to choose to be going forward. One of the things I think is most scary to people and causes both literal and functional climate denialism is this notion that this is the way we've always been. There's no other way we can be, so we just have to stay on this path. And I hear this all the time in lots of different spaces. There's no way we can change on the level that you're saying. There's no way we can do that. And once people believe that there is no option to live differently, then it leads to a kind of nihilism that makes people really unable to act. And so I think we need to lift up stories of places where we have done differently throughout history. We need to amplify when we come up with solutions, even if they're on small scales. We need to tell those stories really well so that people begin to have hope that we are able to change and we are able to do something different. We've had some, fancy communicators look at the climate movement and say, we are terrible communicators, that we communicate all doom and gloom. And rarely do we say to people, here's our path forward. Rarely do we lift up examples of where things are working well, and people need that. We are not going to see a massive human evolution and transformation from shame and gloom exclusively. I'm not saying we shouldn't tell the truth about what's happening. I read the climate news on a regular basis. Not necessarily great for your happiness index. But, and I'm not saying we don't tell the truth, but I'm also saying if we're asking people to walk another path, we have to give people a vision of what is possible and lift up the opportunities that are before us. I also just want to note, again, if you're in a faith community, to use the relationships you have in other cities, towns, states, other places in the world as an opportunity to build collective action. Sometimes I'm like, what's the point of us all being connected if all we do is issue statements together? Could we not do more and really figure out how we might share initiatives, how we might share resources, how we might share stories, how we might put our resources together so it's 600 of us doing something instead of 10 congregations of 60 people each, right? And so really thinking about how we use that. And then the last thing I'll just say is, if we believe something greater and higher is possible, it should seem like we believe that when we're out there organizing. I really want to encourage those of us who come from a place of faith and joy and possibility and hope to live that fiercely, because the climate movement needs it. And by golly, if the faith community doesn't have hope, I mean, what chance do we have of moving forward? All right, so that's my piece on faith communities. If anybody has a question, we can talk a little bit about that later. But I want to talk specifically now about the question of what is the role of the suburbs. Now, I'm not going to do a whole treatise on the formation of the suburbs, but what I will say is that the suburbs exist as they are because of policy. They did not just naturally form this way and people just happened to choose this place. The only reason that suburbs exist as they do is that particularly in the 1950s, there was a coordinated government effort to make it possible. You could do a lot of reading about why that is true. There was obviously a boom of more people, and we did need to figure out where those people were going to live. One cannot deny the role of race and class in decisions about who was going to be where and who didn't want to live where. And so we destroyed whole communities to build highways so that people could get to certain places and turn them into communities. It is worth noting, if you live in a suburb, you should take the time to look and ask the question, did your suburb have covenants? Because many of them did. Covenants were documents about who was supposed to live there and who was not. Often they were concrete agreements and sometimes tacit conversations with real estate agents about who should be shown the houses in a particular place and who should not. Sometimes they were even more explicit prohibitions on banks lending to people and offering people homes. And it is worthwhile, no matter where you live, to take an opportunity to understand those dynamics because they continue to play out to this day. Sometimes I hear from people and they'll say, I don't know how, we just can't get people to move here. And many times that's because in the past, there have been very concrete messages sent, sometimes that continue to this day, about who belongs and who doesn't in that community. And so the creation of suburbs themselves was part of a concerted effort. I'm not going to talk about the nuclear family tonight unless somebody asks me a question about it, because it is something that I like to talk about a lot. Is a failed social policy that encourages increased consumption. But I'm not going to go to there. That's not in my notes for tonight. But if you ask me about it, I would definitely love to talk about it. And the creation of the suburbs was connected to a number of different policies that really, really ensconced environmental injustices into most of our land use policies around the country. There are many definitions for what environmental justice is, but I used the simple two questions: who bears the burden and who gets the benefits? Again and again, you see policies in which some communities are asked to take polluting power plant, after chemical waste dump, after incineration plant, while other people have plenty of open space and good low-cost energy. We have had a long tradition of concentrating the burdens in some places, mostly urban communities or small rural communities or suburbs, or I would say, outer ring cities like New Bedford and Somerset and other places, and then concentrating the benefits of trees and open space and plenty of land around in other communities. And we've made decisions like, don't put sidewalks here, that encouraged people to use their cars to get around and made it impossible for people who didn't have cars to actually even visit those communities. And so the first work that I want to say for folks to do is to know your history. How was your community formed? What were the decisions that were made? And what has been done even recently to either reinforce or push back on those patterns? Because the need to have a car, now, the creation of the suburbs does not mean we all have to have big cars. That's a whole nother thing. But the need to actually have a car is really driven by policies that make it impossible in some communities to actually get around if you don't have one. And so asking people to all get EVs or asking people to take public transit is literally impossible in some communities. And public transit, I do want to note, is the greenest solution. I do have an EV. I don't deny that, but I do recognize that the mining it will take for everybody to have the same number of cars that we have as EVs, that we currently have as combustion cars, it is not viable going forward. So reduction in cars, but the real investment in public transit. And when you do that historical work, you may find that your local leaders blocked public transit. Why? To keep poor people out of your community. And so knowing the policies is really important, because individual action, I want to say, is important. I'm not saying that we shouldn't all make individual choices. I spend a lot of time trying to figure that out. We will not transform our world based solely on people making individual choices. We actually have to rethink how we live, and we have to rethink the previous policies that centered life around cars, rethink the previous policies that caused sprawl and led to a lot of our forest systems being detached from each other and therefore not able to perform the role as carbon sinks that they could be if they were integrated and connected forest systems. We have to rethink a lot of those things, not just each of us in our own homes. We actually really have to ask tough questions of our elected leaders, of our neighbors and our communities about who we want to be and how we go from the policies that created it as it is now to what we think we could and should be doing. And so knowing first what the history is, knowing what those policies are, knowing how they formed them is first. The second is to disrupt those patterns of decision-making and to call them out. I try to be a huge advocate for open space. I believe in it. But there have been times in my own experience as a municipal leader when I feel like people are using trees and open space as an excuse to be NIMBY because they don't really support affordable housing. So I say to people, we're going to look for a both and solution. We're going to look for a solution that is about saving open space and about creating affordable housing because we have a deep need for that. And so really calling those things out and disrupting those patterns, even when it means pushing back on the things you care about and really figuring out how do I make sure that the things that we're doing moving forward are not about treating my sibling in a way that does not value their lives in the same way as mine. And again, this is about coming back to this question of ecological justice. It's not just about us having a better and different relationship with the trees and non-human species that are around us. We absolutely need to do that. But not in a way that makes the same human beings that always bear the burden bear it once again. And not in ways that excuse us for keeping intact policies that are about exclusion. Because if we can't love the other people in our species, I can tell you we cannot forge transformative relationships with species beyond our own. We definitely have to take care of our own home and our own species at the same time that we're building a different and transformative relationship with the rest of the species on this planet. So knowing our history, calling it out, and disrupting the patterns. And finally, and that you need to do in solidarity with other communities. So I know that there are folks that came out in support of battles that we've had in Boston, who came from the suburbs to support work that we were doing to fight a pipeline in West Roxbury. We need again and again that kind of solidarity where people are saying, not here and not there too. But then sometimes we need you to take on your fair share. And I will say this as an example. This is something I know as a municipal leader, but I knew it before I was a municipal leader. Some communities are creating all of the electric generation and other communities are doing none. Some communities have disproportionate numbers of substations and some communities have none. For instance, Boston has a number. Brookline has none. So they turn on their lights every day and receive the benefits, but never the burdens. We need communities that have had a disproportionate benefit to start raising their hands for the burdens. If we are going to electrify our entire state across our communities, it will require new substations to be built. I will know we have a chance of fighting and winning against this climate crisis when suburban communities who have found time and time again how to push the burden into the neighboring community start raising their hands and saying, if we are installing heat pumps, we also have to take on substations. I knew I wasn't getting any claps on that one, but yeah, that is where we have to go, because full electrification can't happen without that. And finally, in all of this work, again, 2 reminders: to act in solidarity, to not just look in your own community, but ask, where have the burdens been placed in the past? As you look at that history, figuring out what are the communities adjacent to my own that have been picking up extra weight because we haven't, and how do we approach this work together? And then also to bring that message to your municipal leaders first, choosing to elect people who have a wider view and do not encourage people to be NIMBY. Do not encourage people to sort of externalize the burdens on other communities, including your legislators. Before I was in this role, I would go up to the State House, and there is often a divide in how people approach it and who they're thinking about when we ask and demand climate action. I think it would be powerful if communities would have that conversation in advance and then demand that their legislators respond. In theory, they're all up there together, and so they should be able to find common ground. And in theory, they should come back to us and help us to be the best of ourselves. I would say that the electoral system doesn't often encourage that. And if we really want that to happen, we need to send people to those halls with the demand that they find a way to do it in the right way that asks everybody to bear the benefits and the burdens equally. And in order to do that, we will have to right past harms when some people were always asked to take beyond their fair share. We shouldn't ask the community of Chelsea to bear not another burden, period. We should not ask the community of Springfield or New Bedford to bear not another burden. We cannot ask the communities of East Boston or Mattapan to bear not another burden. But that only happens when other folks stand up and say, we see those past patterns, we know they are wrong, we stand together demanding that we do it differently. Because I will tell you this, if you fought for the next electricity generation plant to be in Weston, let me tell you, the energy efficiency work in this community would just skyrocket. If we were planting all of our polluting facilities in our wealthiest suburbs, I know we would beat the climate crisis faster than ever. Because when folks who have the privilege and the power have to face it directly, their sense of priority changes drastically when it's not someone else's kid with the inhaler, but maybe their own. It will lead to a radical transformation in the priorities of this Commonwealth and, quite frankly, this country. So I'm going to stop there because I want to make sure that we have time for questions. And I want to engage. What do you see? Does that speak to you? You can ask me something very specific. You can push back if you're like, I don't know what you're talking about. Let's engage. Okay, I see we first question and that okay, 1, 2. There we go. Well, I'm just saying to them, what are your responses? Do you have specific questions? If you think that's a load of crap, tell me why. Let's have dialogue.
Thanks so much. I have a really specific question. Yeah. So here we are, we're actually Waylanders, but Wayland and Weston, we're outside 95, 128, but there's this whole issue going on in East Boston, like the substation issue. How on earth did it get approved? I don't know, but I read about this, I'm frustrated. And I love this idea of forging community and connection between the suburbs and the greater Boston area. I think it's really foundational to equity to build these relationships. And the best way to build a friendship is to work together. So it's a big question.
Yeah.
But how could people in communities like Wayland, Weston, how could we constructively engage to bring a more equitable solution to this big substation issue in East Boston?
So I will have to be careful because I officially.
Recommendations for
Yeah,
the
so-
suburbs.
So here's the reality. There's two realities I'm gonna say. First of all, more substations will be needed, period. If we're going to electrify, if that is our role, if that is our goal. Now, we could all decide we're going to use less energy, period. So I want to just say efficiency, efficiency, efficiency first. Like we need to do that. Like first, we should decrease the amount of energy that we're using because then we won't need as much energy infrastructure. So I think really thinking about, one, have you done retrofitting on your own space, making sure that, as my grandmother would say, you're not heating the outside, like really thinking about how we are looking at the envelopes in our buildings. And let me tell you, I don't know if any of you have been to Europe, but like we are lagging so far behind what they are doing over there. I mean, it's just like embarrassing. That's why I try to spend some time in Europe and Canada, because when I see what we're doing, you know, I can go to other cities and then I feel good sometimes about what Boston is doing, like, oh, great. And then I go over there and I'm like, oh. So I think there's a lot that we need to do to decrease our usage. And the state, like our current strategy is electrification. So if that's what's going to happen, I need to say this, there will be more substations needed, period. So now the question is, how many state substations do you have in Wayland? But you turn the lights on and there's power. So I think this is this question of starting with your history and your policies. Who is bearing the burden for you to have electricity? Maybe Wayland has a substation. Maybe it's taking on its own. What I would say is, having looked at the map, I don't know exactly Wayland and Weston, but you can see the overwhelming burden of electrical infrastructure sitting in lower income suburban communities and in cities. Now, we don't have any electricity generation in Boston anymore because honestly, it's so expensive for the cost of land. Nobody would buy it anymore, right? But again, this question of who is bearing the burden for you to have electricity? And starting with that, of knowing that truth. And then the second piece is to recognize if we're going to do electrification, there will be more substations, which the beautiful means we have an opportunity for people to step up and take more than their fair share because we're going to have to build a bunch more of them. I think one of the challenges is I see people sometimes out there protesting the substation, also saying we need to electrify everything and never asking the question about whether their own community that they live in is actually putting its burden on someone else. So the question is, again, like I can't talk about that because I'm part of a lawsuit around that. But what I can say is this. The questions that people should ask is this for electricity that's actually being used by East Boston residents? Or is it being used by the airport, which took 50% of the land of East Boston? And I can tell you that East Boston is not the majority of people flying out of that airport. So whoever is using the airport is asking the citizens of East Boston to bear a disproportionate burden for them to be able to fly here and there. I don't know exactly how many substations there are in Swampscott. I'm just guessing, not as many. And so I think this whole question of, if we believe in electrifying everything, and I think most of us who are in this work have really been looking at it. I mean, it's one of the reasons I have been really looking at, like, what are the other kinds of technologies that we can promote, particularly for the issue of heat. You know, it's a deeper question, but I think this question of who's bearing the burdens and who's getting the benefit is always the place to start. I'm just not sure in many communities that are being asked to bring on substations, if it's because of their usage or because they bear the usage for all of the communities around them that are unwilling to take the burden. And so I think starting with just with Wayland, I don't know, but it's worth looking into, where does your electricity come from and what community? Is it your own, or is it another community that's making that possible? And then as we get to that next point, how do you begin to say to people, if we're going to install heat pumps across our community, which we need to do, we should also begin a planning process to host a substation. Because those two things have to go together, or else we're getting all the benefits of the green revolution while asking someone else to bear the ugly stuff that we don't want to deal with. And that is also the case, for instance, in solar. I am so excited that people are adopting solar, but there is disproportionate solar being installed in the suburbs. And so that what that means is that people are often getting a better electricity rate than in the city of Boston, where it is much harder because in the city of Boston, you have this density of housing that is much harder. Like even in my own, I live in a triple decker, there's 3 condos. It's way more complicated to do a solar project than it probably is out here, where many of your rules do not even allow people to have multifamily housing, right? And it's the easiest and simplest to put solar panels on homes where you actually have a whole track around you and they don't have to talk to your neighbors, because in order to get up there, you have to negotiate. So what we're having is, when we had solar subsidies, guess where their solar subsidies were going overwhelmingly? So all of these questions of who's getting the benefit and who, if you start with that question on any issue, you will find maybe disturbing information, but I would say opportunities for action. I have never asked that question in a focused way and not come away with an opportunity for action and solidarity. So, yes.
We have a question online from Lori. I want the suburbs to do better to bear the burdens of their consumption, electricity, trash, pollution, etc. And I understand that the current system is unfair. However, I don't think it is practical to expect suburban residents to accept those burdens, as they certainly should, without the imposition of government mandates or economic redistribution policies. What role do you see these playing?
Yeah. Oh, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying, if you're looking to elected leaders to do that, that nothing bears out that they will just do that on their own. I really believe it will require a movement of people demanding that for that to happen. Because if most of the people in the community are voting for someone to do X, Y, and Z, and that's what they feel like their mandate is, they'll go up to the State House and do that, right? I would love to believe that the space of being in community together, and there are exceptional leaders out there that will do the right thing and that will bring people along. But if you look at most change that we've seen happen in human history, it didn't really come from just exceptional leaders sort of leading the people, right? Sometimes it did. Like, as an example, Roosevelt was able to do what he was able to do, but that was because the Depression was so bad that people were like, if you've got a good idea to get us out of this, we're with you, right? Like, he was able to say, this is how it's going to benefit each and every one of you with these New Deal policies. Now, it is worth noting that New Deal policies were good on class and they were terrible on race. There are two groups that were completely left out of Social Security. Who? Anybody know? Two jobs that are not included to this day in Social Security. Anybody know? Domestic workers and, farmers. Farmers and domestic workers. Who were all the farmers and domestic workers at that time? Or the large number of them? Black and Latinx folks, Asian folks. So that was the deal he made to get white people behind it. They were like, I'm not paying into the retirement fund for my maid. And that was the deal that got cut. So I think if we elect transformative leaders, they can be transformative. But I would say when you look at much of the change that's happened in this country, either things got so bad that people were open to something new, or people organized in communities and elected transformative leaders with a mandate to do something different. And so I think from my perspective as climate activists, if we're waiting for government to do it for us, we should start making our boats now. But if we're willing to demand it and create an opening, if we are willing to do the work of talking to our neighbors, if we are willing to make it happen at the town level, that is how I think it grows, not the other way around. Sometimes, every once in a while, a leader comes along, but even then you can often see that they came up out of a movement that made it possible for them to flourish, and then it caught on. And so, again, I push back on the idea that if we all just do our individual actions, it will change, because the policies around us make it hard. How many of you could really live without a car? The whole community was set up so you couldn't do that, right? So yeah, it would be great if we all walked. But that's not real. That's not real. There's policies that set it up so that we couldn't. That's not a viable way to live in most of our communities. And so we do have to talk about density and how we might move forward. I mean, there's even things like I ask, like, we now know that people age. And when they get older, steps are a challenge. Why are we building new houses that are not accessible for people with mobility challenges? Because we're all eventually going to have some mobility challenges. But it requires that we start demanding it and we start working. And sometimes it means showing up to meetings that like nobody shows up to. Like, for instance, I say to people all the time, your trash policy is a place worth looking. Who's bearing the burdens of your trash? And I can tell you, not that many people show up to the public meetings around trash. You could revolutionize the trash policy in your town if you just show up. There are so many policies that have been created around ideas and around ways of being and around many of the covenants that were originally created that are contributing to the climate crisis. And you don't have to change all of them, but you could really lean in on one, know it well, know it to its core, and keep pushing until it begins shifting.
This is a question from me. I raised my child as a single parent, and I wrote my master's thesis in seminary on single parents. So I have to take your bait and ask you about the nuclear family and your thoughts on that related to the climate change.
I'm glad you asked, truthfully. I was like, kind of put it in my notes and I was like, that's not really what they asked you for. But I actually believe it is at the heart of the notion of the suburbs. We had this belief that we were going to create singular nuclear pods, called the singular pods that we call the nuclear family. And I know, yeah, it was like house, 2 parents and 2.5 kids and a dog, right? Like that whole, I mean, you can see all of the like commercials from the 1950s and like even some of the jingles that even some I remember, right? That I remember growing up. So the reason I'm pushing back on this is like, this is an experiment of literally the last like 70-ish years. Yeah, basically in the 50s. It's an idea. It's the same thing like wedding rings. Oh my gosh, we do this because like people have been doing it since the beginning of time. No, they weren't. De Beers, it was a diamond company, and in the 1920s, people weren't really buying diamonds. They were like, how do we get the everyday person to want to buy this thing that they never needed before and never wanted before? And what did they do? In the early days of movies, they created the proposal with the ring. Before that, people did not. You cannot find many cultures in the late 1800s that knew anything about anybody's ring. You will notice that people say, oh, it was my grandmother's ring, but like a lot of times it's not a diamond or like whatever. And that is because this wasn't a thing. But then they promoted it. You know, you had these like movies that everybody did, and suddenly everybody was like, oh my gosh, that's what I need in my life. Right. And so now we have this tradition that everybody believes is like a deep tradition that is only like 100 years old. The nuclear family. Human societies did not organize themselves around 2 parents, 2 kids, and a dog for thousands of years. They organized themselves in tribes and extended families. This notion of the nuclear family is deeply tied to industrialization and the ability to move workers where they need to be, to build company towns that people could move to. And you didn't have to pick up like 18 people to get there. And so we then build housing units that are all built around this. And what it means is that like every 4 people has to have their own, like, what is it? The mixing machine that everybody's like requests for their wedding that I was like, I don't use that. Anyway, but we all have to have our own personal appliances. We all have to have this. We all have to have that for distributed across 4 people. When in the past, we would have distributed those same resources across a much larger group of people. And so what it then leads is to increased consumption and the need to create more dwellings, et cetera, because people are living in small units. Here's the thing that I would say, like, this is not just because of like a climate policy. I don't know any of my friends who are not struggling with childcare. I don't know anybody that's not struggling, some of them with their kids young and their parents old and trying to figure out how they support 2 generations with this like bifurcated lifestyle that just doesn't work. We need to live in larger units that allow us to share the load a little better. Now, my husband's an introvert. We've got to figure out what to do for the introverts of the world who don't want to be with everyone all the time. But I think there's ways to figure it out. And I do say to him, like, I can't imagine that people figured it out for thousands of years and like we just fundamentally can't make it happen. But it's a lot more effective in the sense that like people are not, if people are in the prime of their working life, someone else in the family is not. And so then you have this ability to share resources and to share needs. This is another place that I think congregations could be really powerful. Okay, maybe everyone's not going to move back to like, if their family's in Lincoln, Nebraska, and they're in Lincoln, Massachusetts, like maybe this isn't going to work. So we then now need to ask, can we create alternative family units that allow people to share resources? We are getting lonelier and lonelier, even though there's more of us. And that's because we're disconnected. And this notion that like kids leave the house and then they have to go find, they live with roommates, but only as long, and if you're truly successful, you would never live cooperatively with other people because that's crazy. The sign of your success is you go out and find your own apartment, even if you like have to eat ramen to be able to afford it because they're so daggone expensive at this point, right? And so there's all these notions about what we've told people about how they're supposed to live that are functionally challenging for people to actually manage all of the relationships, to share the load. It also creates the need to construct more houses and to buy more stuff. And then you're sitting there lonely. And so it's interesting because there's all this data that's been coming out of how lonely we are. What do we need to do? But nobody's ever willing to ask the question, maybe the social arrangements we've created don't work. They're only 70 years old. It's not like we can't reverse them and go back to something that worked better or innovate towards something new that might give the best of what we've learned from this and the best of what we had before. But I don't think it works. I don't think it works for our children. I don't think it works for our elders. I don't think it works for people who have to work. I think everybody feels frustrated in this arrangement and stressed out. And I don't think it needs to be. For instance, why do we build senior homes so far from schools? You have people with wisdom and often a desire to connect with young kids, like wishing that they could see their grandkids more. Why wouldn't we put those two resources together? But we don't. So that's my thing on the nuclear family. I will get off my high horse about that. But yeah.
Tom, go ahead.
When you think about environmental justice and climate, how important is building more affordable housing in the suburbs? Is that a big deal, or is that something that's not so important?
I mean, I think of it as pretty important. I mean, so here's the thing I'll say. I mean, there's multiple layers of what I think are important. And there's sort of the answer I would give you if I thought we were all ready to jump into the full transformation of the world, and the answer that I would give you that pushes us within the context of the world that we're already in. So I actually believe housing should be a human right, period, because it's what people need to live. And the fact that people spend so much of their energy struggling just to have a place to put over their head is not just an injustice, it's also lots of wasted energy that we could be devoting in other directions. I think having affordable housing in suburban communities is really an important part of beginning to reverse that history of exclusion and changing how we do that. My preference would be to do it in a way that is transit oriented, because I don't think what we should do is stack poor people up in a community where you have to have a car to get around, knowing that they don't have necessarily the resources to like fund the lifestyle that the whole community is built around. And so the question is, are there communities, for instance, where there is a commuter rail stop already? And can some of that be concentrated there? Where are there communities where there's some possibilities for public transit? So I think it is very important, and people need to do it in a practical way that makes it possible for people to live and live well in a community, as opposed to being like, we're going to just plop this random thing here and you can't get around from there, and then be like, I can't understand why no low-income people moved here. So I think it should be done, has to be done practically. I also think sprawl needs to stop. But I think density is the most effective way to decrease sprawl. And if I had my highest desire, we would create mixed income housing, but sufficient of it that everyone can live. Where I have troubles is you have 600 units of affordable housing and you turn those into mixed income housing, knowing that you're not going to replace the units that were lost. So I believe in the power of mixed income housing, and it should be done making sure that we're building sufficient so that everybody has what they need. And where we've seen it happen the most is like in New Orleans, where they took like a 1,200 unit building and then took it down to like 600 units and then made it mixed income. So now you only have 200 affordable units left. And you're like, what happened to the other 1,000 people that were in those units? That's an injustice. And so there's that tension of sometimes feeling like you end up having to settle for it to be all affordable, even though you think mixed income is better, because you know that you can't get people to build the number of units that would be required to make sure everybody has what they need. So that's my long answer, but absolutely. And it needs to happen. And I hope people do it in a good way.
One final question.
Yes.
I can't resist asking you a little bit of a legislation question, since you've been a powerful advocate on that.
Okay.
You mentioned going to Europe.
Yep.
Where they're so far ahead, especially in Western Europe, in terms of energy efficiency and whatnot. Price of energy there, a lot higher than here. Price of energy in Europe, they pay a lot more for their energy than we do.
Mm-hmm.
Here in New England, we have been successful in putting a price on carbon emissions. With Deval Patrick and the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, we did that.
Mm-hmm.
It actually was great legislation. We all actually are paying a small carbon tax right now. That's going in energy efficiency programs. You've been involved with legislative proposals to put additional prices on carbon, or rethink the way we put a price on carbon, and then use that money for affordable housing on a sustainable basis, or to address issues of equity. How do we do that in a way that is that will be compelling for most of our legislators?
Yeah.
That's the issue, right?
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, it goes back to the two questions that I'm always asking, which are who's getting the burden and who's getting the benefit, right? And so I think that we have to actually, I repeat it so often because I really, really think if we started every meeting, every legislative visit, every policy drafting from that perspective, man, if we could just get people to take their fair share of the burden, that would be like revolutionary, right? So like as an example, I believe that communities that produce electricity and host substations should pay less. Communities that don't bear those burdens should pay more, right? So how do you think about changing the way people are setting it, changing the incentives so that people also do right? And then you get to hard places like, as an example, my cousins, most of my cousins and graduated from Wayland, my cousin Joel and Caleb and Lael and Mallory. My cousin Kalila went to Latin Academy in Boston. But anyway, so they spend a lot of time out there, right? And so I know there's not that many sidewalks, right? So, then asking, there just has to be an interplay between what you charge people for and then the ways you make it possible for them to change behavior. And so that's challenging. But I do think, as an example, like we probably need to downsize the footprints of our houses, as an example, because we're just not having big families. We're just not. Some of us are, but most of us are not. And so I think, yes, I believe in the power of price being a powerful incentive. I think where it gets touchy is some folk really don't have a lot of control about how much income they bring in and they spend. And I'll say this, like, that has changed for me over my lifetime. When I first started, after college, I came back here, I ran an organization, I loved doing it. Sometimes I got paid, sometimes I did not. And with my college loans, I was like, there were months where it finished and I didn't have a lot left over. And so a $20 increase on my electricity bill would have sent me to like, what do I got to do differently, like, to make this all work? At this point in my life, you know, if the scallops go bad, I'm like really upset just from like GP, general principle, but not because I needed that and like, now I don't have a meal that I budgeted for, right? And so I've lived my life in different ways. And so it's just really hard because if you're not careful, you end up shifting the burden onto people who just don't have the leeway to handle that, who are already doing somewhat dangerous things to try to make ends meet. What's going to be very fascinating is there's a new policy in California where they are now creating new rate classes. So many places in the country have 2 rate classes, right? Like your standard rate class and then your low income rate class. It's a lot. It can be very hard to get into that low income rate class, right? But most places have something. We call it the R2. California is trying to set it up so that there's actually, from what I understand, 3 rate classes. And as your income increases, you pay more per kilowatt hour for your electricity. Now, I think this is a powerful and interesting piece. And there are people who are already pushing back on it. And some of them, I think, have really strong arguments about like what needs to be done and how if you're not careful, you don't incentivize people to do it. And what do we do about electrification? Could you be pushing people to stay on fossil fuels? And so then the question is, should we do the same thing for gas and make it work? I mean, like, how do we make sure that you're not disincentivizing people to electrify? But I think the key to that is, and I've seen it in my own life, the more money you have, the more options you have to do the right thing. And so what they're trying to do is not set up a situation, well, and this is one of the big arguments that people are saying, what might happen is truly rich people will just totally decarbonize themselves and leave the grid. Which might not be, I mean, I went back and forth and I was like, well, if we get enough of them to do it, because they are definitely not decarbonizing right now. Like, is that an improvement? Right? But if everybody leaves the grid, it is also true that poor people end up disproportionately having to cover the cost of the grid, and that is unjust. So I think I raise this to say, like, we have to be thoughtful, driven always from the question of who bears the benefit, who gets the benefits, and who bears the burdens. This is an attempt to get people who have the most to bear the most. You can have the example of unintended consequences. And this is one place where I will slightly break code protocol because I would care about this, whether I was in this role or not. But one example of this is competitive electric supply, where the legislature in 1998, I believe it was, set up a rule that allowed you, I don't know if you've ever paid attention to this on your, but how many do you guys have does Wayland have an aggregation, municipal aggregation?
Choice aggregation.
Yes,
Yeah.
yep, and Weston, yeah, okay, great. All right, so it's in the, yeah, I know the DPU takes 8 million years. With 4 years? When I'm not being taped, I'll tell you what I have to say about the DPU and our own experience with CC. And anyway, that's a side note. But I think the reality is so they created this place where you can have usually whomever your utility is controls the infrastructure and the supply to your house. They make sure that your meter is on, et cetera, or the distribution to your house. And then somebody else can provide the supply. The whole idea behind this was that competition was going to create cheaper prices for consumers. The exact opposite has happened. The Attorney General has found that ratepayers in Massachusetts, since that reform, have paid more than $500 million over what they would have paid if they were on the standard electric rate. So I'm lifting this up. And again, this is me mixing a little bit because, as many of you know, your legislator has a lot of pull in this issue. And it's being considered right now, like literally right now. Like maybe in my day job, I was testifying about it yesterday. Maybe the AG was also testifying about it. Maybe. And that's an example of, many of you may have never heard of it because they never target neighborhoods like Wayland and Weston. They go after communities where people do not speak English as their first language, and they get people to sign contracts they cannot read. They go after seniors who are on a fixed income, low-income seniors who are excited by the idea that their rate is going to go down. Yeah, it's going to go down. It'll go down for between 1 and 6 months. And then you are on a variable fixed rate following the market. We've got people paying 60 cents a kilowatt hour. Even at its highest, Eversource has only been 25 cents a kilowatt hour in the past few years. I mean, like, that's what it skyrocketed to when the war in Ukraine and blah, so 60 cents a kilowatt hour. And this is just like, these companies are horrible. I don't see what they provide. And in theory, it was to give people lower prices and to give people the option for more renewable energy in their stream. And sometimes they say that. They say they're going to give you more renewable energy. And sometimes it's like 5% above RPS, but you're paying like, 4 and 5 times what you would have been paying. I mean, with that, you could just go buy stake in a solar project, and that would be better for the environment than you paying all of this money that goes to who knows where. So there's lots of spaces. There's so much space in our climate and environmental policy to keep asking this question: who bears the burden and who bears the benefit? And when we design policies, we always have to double check, because that is an example of a policy that I think came from a good place and has gone wrong. We will need to pay attention to what happens in California, because it does feel like an attempt to ask people who have more to bear greater burden as a way of accelerating where the state ends up going in terms of electrification and emissions. We should pay attention to see if it works. I hope that they will adjust quickly if they see negative or problematic ramifications. But I don't want us to get to the point where, because not everything we do worked out perfectly, we don't keep trying, because we absolutely need new solutions. We absolutely need to move with urgency, and we've got to keep finding a way to bring equity into every part of what we're doing. Because going back to what I said originally, if we were to lower our emissions, but to leave the social injustices that have created our world in place, I don't think we deserve to survive.